He didn't know her name. He didn't know she existed. But 1 month before she walked out of the dark and collapsed on his road, he rode into town, bought 2 cans of pale yellow paint, and spent 3 days scrubbing a room he had kept closed for 7 years. He didn't know who was coming. He just knew he couldn't live in a graveyard anymore, and the universe sent her. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment below. Tell us, which moment made you stop breathing? We are here, and we read everything.
$4.37. It sat in the right pocket of Abigail Preston S. wool coat. 3 silver dollars, 1 worn 50-cent piece, a handful of copper. She kept her hand wrapped around the coins, feeling their hard, cold edges. It was ground zero, the sum total of 38 years of a respectable, rule-abiding life. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. October 14, 1878. The wind, sweeping down into Caldwell, Kansas, carried the bitter, metallic taste of early winter. Abigail stood on the edge of the dirt road, shifting the weight on her shoulder. Sarah was 9 years old, but right now, asleep against her mother's collarbone, she felt as heavy as the world itself. Abigail didn't cry. Crying was a luxury for women who still had parlor rooms to faint in. Instead, she did the math. Again, $3,200. That was the phantom debt her late husband, Thomas, had left behind. He died of a sudden stroke in September. 3 days after they put him in the Missouri dirt, the men from the bank knocked on her door. Nice suits, soft voices, hard eyes. Thomas had signed the papers. Abigail hadn't known a thing about it. But in the eyes of the law, her ignorance didn't matter. A woman doesn't own the bricks of her own home. Sarah? Abigail had whispered to her daughter the day the sheriff nailed the eviction notice to their front door. Under Missouri law, a wife is just an extension of her husband's property. We don't have the right to sign the deed, but we are the ones who get crushed when the roof caves in. That was the truth, spoken plainly, so the girl would learn early that the world was built on ledgers, not fairness. Now, 31 days later, that ledger had chased them all the way to Caldwell. Abigail adjusted Sarah's sleeping form and looked toward the schoolhouse at the end of the street. She had been there an hour ago. She had put on her cleanest collar, smoothed her hair, and asked the principal, a round-bellied man named Mr. Abernathy, for the open teaching position. He was polite. For exactly 4 minutes, then he asked about her husband. He asked why a respectable widow had left Missouri. He asked if the rumors of financial scandal were true. Abigail hadn't lied. She told him the debt was Thomas's, but the ruin was hers. Mr. Abernathy had cleared his throat. He looked at the floor, anywhere but her eyes. Mrs. Preston, we require a teacher of unburdened standing. The school board cannot have a woman tied to scandal educating our youth. Surely, you understand. She understood perfectly. The rejection wasn't violent. It was quiet. It was the way the respectable women of Caldwell gathered their heavy wool skirts closer to their ankles when Abigail walked past the mercantile. It was the way the baker looked past her in line. No one threw stones. They just made her invisible. They stripped her of her humanity simply by refusing to look at her. That was the implicit cruelty of a polite society. The wind howled, snapping Abigail back to the present. The temperature was dropping fast. She carried Sarah toward the mercantile awning, a small mercy of a wooden roof. She set her bag down. Her arms trembled from the effort, but she locked her knees. She would not fall. The mercantile door opened. Mrs. Higgins, the owner's wife, stepped out with a broom. She looked at Abigail, then at the sleeping child. Pity flashed in her eyes, a brief warm thing. But before Mrs. Higgins could speak, her husband's voice barked from inside the store. "Tell them to move along, Martha. I won't have vagrants on the porch. Law says we're liable if they freeze on our wood." Mrs. Higgins flinched. She gave Abigail a helpless, apologetic look. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "He says you have to go." Abigail looked at the woman. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't beg. She just held Mrs. Higgins's gaze with steady, terrifying clarity. "The law says my husband's debts are mine to suffer, Mrs. Higgins," Abigail said, her voice cutting through the wind like a razor. "And the law might say you're liable for your porch. But the law didn't tell your husband to turn a 9-year-old girl out into the freezing dark. He chose that himself. Tell him not to blame the courts for his lack of a soul." Mrs. Higgins swallowed hard, her hand gripping the broom handle, shame painting her cheeks red. She couldn't say a word. Abigail had spoken the absolute truth. Rules were often just convenient hiding places for cowards. Abigail didn't wait for a response. She hoisted Sarah back up. It was 10 o'clock at night when the rain finally broke. It wasn't a gentle autumn shower. It was a Texas border rain, horizontal, freezing, striking the face like handfuls of gravel. Abigail stood at the edge of the town limits. The darkness ahead was absolute. While inside the mercantile earlier, she had overheard 2 ranch hands talking about a place 12 miles west. The Vance Ranch. A man named Silas Vance lived quiet, minded his own business, kept a clean bunkhouse. 12 miles. In the mud, in the dark. Sarah shivered against her neck. "Mama, are we walking again?" "Yes, sweetie." Abigail took off her own woolen scarf. She wrapped it tight around Sarah's head and shoulders, leaving her own neck exposed to the biting rain. She didn't hesitate. She didn't complain to the empty sky. In that simple, quiet motion of removing her scarf, Abigail Preston's core was laid bare. She was not a victim waiting for a hero on a white horse. She was a mother, a woman robbed of her rights, but fully in command of her spirit. They had taken her home, her job, and her husband's good name. But they could not take her legs, and they could not take her will. She clutched her worn leather bag in one hand, anchored her daughter with the other, and stepped off the wooden boardwalk. Her boots sank deep into the freezing red mud. She turned west, and she began to walk. The road was not a road. It was a river of freezing red clay. The rain came down in sheets. It was loud. It drowned out the sound of Abby's own breathing. Every step was a negotiation with the earth. The mud sucked at her leather boots, trying to pull them right off her feet. She had been walking for 3 hours, maybe 4. Time didn't matter anymore, only distance. Sarah was asleep, but her body shook violently against Abby's chest. The child was freezing. Abby adjusted her grip. Her arms burned. Her back felt like it was splitting in two. But she kept moving. Left foot, right foot, pull, step, breathe. She couldn't see the edges of the plains. She could only see the 10 feet of darkness in front of her face. Then the ground simply gave way. It was a washout, a dip in the road hidden by muddy water. Abby's left boot slipped. Her ankle twisted inward. A sharp, sickening pop echoed under the rain. Fire shot up her calf. She went down hard. She managed to twist her body at the last second, taking the brunt of the fall on her shoulder, so Sarah wouldn't hit the mud. Sarah woke up with a gasp. "Mama, I'm all right," Abby gasped. She tasted copper in her mouth. She had bitten her tongue. "I'm right here, baby." Abby sat in the mud. The freezing water soaked through her wool coat down to her skin. She tried to bend her ankle. White-hot pain blinded her for a second. She couldn't walk on it. Not carrying a 50-pound child. Not in this mud. For the first time in 31 days, a wave of pure, Dark panic crested over her. She looked into the black sky. There was no God in those clouds, just cold water. Then she saw it, a light. It was small, faint, bobbing in the darkness about 50 yards off the road. It wasn't a house light. It was moving. A lantern. Abby didn't yell for help. A woman yelling in the dark in this country usually invited the wrong kind of attention. She pushed herself up onto her good knee. She waited. The light drew closer. She could hear the heavy, sucking sound of hooves in the mud. Then, the outline of a man. He was walking, leading a horse. Behind the horse, tied to a short rope, was a miserable-looking speckled heifer. He stopped. He held the lantern up. The light caught the rain in golden streaks. "Who's there?" His voice was deep, rough. It didn't carry panic, and it didn't carry warmth. It was just a fact. Abby stood up. It took everything she had to put weight on her bad leg, but she did it. She would not meet this man on her knees. The lantern light washed over her. She saw his face, weathered. Hard lines around the mouth, eyes that had seen too much and expected very little. He looked at her. He looked at the child. He looked back at her. He didn't ask what she was doing out here. He didn't ask where her husband was. He just waited. Abby squared her shoulders. She looked him dead in the eye. "I am not asking for charity," she said. Her voice shook from the cold, but the words were steel. "I am looking for the Vance Ranch. If you are Silas Vance, I am asking for exactly one night of shelter. Tomorrow morning, I will propose a working arrangement. If you decline, we will leave. I won't owe you, and you won't owe me." Silas Vance stared at her. The wind howled around them. He was a man who understood the mechanics of pride. He saw the ruined dress. He saw the shivering child. He saw a woman balancing on a broken ankle, offering a business deal in the middle of a flood because it was the only piece of dignity she had left to hold on to. He didn't offer her pity. Pity was a poison to proud people. "I'm Vance," he said. He walked forward. He didn't ask permission. He reached down and lifted Sarah out of Abby's arms. The little girl tensed, but Silas just settled her gently onto the saddle of his horse. He took his heavy canvas slicker off and draped it over the child. He turned back to Abby. "Hold on to the stirrup. It'll pull you along. Keep weight off that left foot." He turned away and started walking. That was it. No questions. No judgment. Just an implicit, absolute respect for her boundaries. He gave her the shelter of his silence. The walk felt like a lifetime. But eventually, the dark shape of a house broke the horizon. A low, wooden structure. No frills. No porch swings. Just a solid roof against the sky. He led them to the kitchen door. He opened it. It was dark inside, but dry. He lit a kerosene lamp on the table. The house was spotless. Bare, but spotless. The smell of old coffee and wood smoke hung in the air. He pointed to a door off the kitchen. "Spare room. Beds made." He didn't linger. He walked back out into the rain to tend to his animals, shutting the door behind him. Abby took Sarah into the room. The sheets were clean. The quilt was thick. Abby stripped off their wet clothes. She wrapped Sarah in the quilt. The child was asleep before her head hit the pillow. Abby sat on the edge of the bed. She touched her swollen ankle. The pain was roaring now, but the air in the room was warm. She looked at the closed door. She was safe. For tonight. The smell of bacon grease woke her. It was early. The sun was barely up, casting a gray, watery light through the window. Abby dressed quickly. Her clothes were still damp, but she put them on anyway. She tied her hair back. She forced her swollen foot into her boot. It took 5 minutes and left her sweating. She walked into the kitchen. Silas was sitting at the table. He was drinking coffee from a tin cup. There was a plate of bacon and biscuits on the stove. 2 extra plates were set on the table. Eat, he said. He didn't look up from his cup. Abba poured a cup of coffee. She sat down across from him. She didn't touch the food yet. My name is Abigail Preston, she said. I am a widow. I was a school teacher in Missouri. I can teach reading, writing, and numbers. I know history. I can also cook, mend clothes, and keep a ledger. Set his cup down. He finally looked at her. In the daylight, she saw the gray in his beard. She saw the scar running along his jawline. A Civil War mark. Union, she guessed. I don't have children, he said. I saw 2 ranch hands yesterday in town, Abby countered. One was an older black man. The other looked native. Can they read? Silas frowned slightly. Arthur and Micah, no, they can't. Then they need to learn, Abby said. It was time to state her case explicitly. Mr. Vance, this country is changing. The frontier is closing. In 5 years, a man who can't read a contract is going to lose his shirt to the men sitting in bank offices. You know this. A man's word used to be enough. Now, it's about what's written on the paper. If your men can't read, they are vulnerable. Silas leaned back in his chair. The wood creaked. He looked at her for a long, quiet minute. He was not a man easily swayed by talk, but he recognized truth when he heard it. 2 hours a day, Silas said. Morning, before they ride out, you cook the meals. You keep the kitchen clean. The girl stays out of the corral. Agreed, Abby said. $8 a month, room and board. Abby nodded. When do I start? Silas stood up. He picked up his hat from the peg by the door. Tomorrow. Let that ankle heal today. And eat the bacon before it gets cold. He walked out. The door clicked shut. Abby looked at the empty chair. A deal struck in 3 minutes. No signatures. No background checks into her husband as ruin. Just a mutual understanding of what needed to be done to survive. She reached for a biscuit. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. The kitchen table was oak, thick, scratched. It had seen a lot of meals, a lot of spilled coffee, and a lot of quiet nights. Now it was a schoolhouse. It was a Tuesday morning, 1 week since Abby had arrived. The rain had stopped, leaving the plains a crisp, bright green. Inside the kitchen, the air was tense. Arthur sat on one side of the table. He was 60 years old. His hands were the size of dinner plates, covered in calluses as thick as boot leather. He looked at the small piece of white chalk resting on his slate board as if it were a rattlesnake. Across from him sat Micah, 22, half Comanche, half white. He sat perfectly still. His face was a mask of polite indifference. He didn't look at the chalk. He looked out the window toward the horizon. Abby stood at the head of the table. She felt the heavy silence. She knew what it was. It wasn't defiance. It was shame. Gentlemen, Abby started. Her voice was gentle, but firm. We are going to begin with the alphabet. Just the shapes. Nothing more. Arthur swallowed hard. He slowly reached out and picked up the chalk. It looked absurdly small in his massive fingers. He pressed it to the slate. It squeaked. The chalk snapped in half. Arthur let out a heavy breath. He put the broken pieces down. He didn't look up. I'm sorry, ma'am, Arthur said. His voice was a low rumble. I appreciate what Mr. Vance is doing. I appreciate you. But I ain't built for this. My hands are too heavy. And my head is too old. Letters are for fine folks. Folks in town. Not for an old dirt kicker like me. Abby didn't smile. She didn't offer empty comforts. She walked around the table and pulled up a chair right next to him. She sat down. She looked at his hands, then up to his eyes. Arthur, look at me. He slowly raised his head. This was the moment, the lesson that wasn't in any primer. You think this chalk is for fine folks? Abby asked. Her tone was sharp, awake. Let me tell you something about fine folks. My husband was one. The men at the bank in Missouri who took my home were fine folks. They wear clean shirts and they never get their hands dirty. She picked up the broken piece of chalk. She placed it back into Arthur S. palm. They use paper and ink to build fences, Abby said, her voice dropping into a fierce whisper. They use the law to take things. They took my house because my name wasn't on a piece of paper. They can take a man's freedom, his wages, and his land, all with a signature. She pointed to his head. But Arthur, once you know how to read, that knowledge is locked right up there. It is yours. It is the only property in this whole wretched, beautiful world that no bank, no sheriff, and no wealthy man can ever seize from you. They can burn your house down, but they can't burn the letters out of your mind. Learning to read isn't a luxury. It is a weapon. Pick it up. The kitchen was dead silent. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Arthur looked at Abby. His eyes were wide. For 60 years, the world had told him he was less than. It had told him his only value was the strength of his back. No one had ever told him he deserved a weapon. Slowly, carefully, Arthur closed his fingers around the chalk. He gripped it differently this time, not like a fragile toy, like a tool, like a hammer. He looked down at the slate. Show me the first one, ma'am. Abby nodded. She drew a large A on her own slate. This is an A, Arthur. It stands like a tent. Arthur copied it. It was shaky. The lines were uneven. But it was an A. He stared at it for a long time, a quiet revolution happening right there at the kitchen table. Across the room, standing in the doorway leading to the porch, was Silas. He had come back for a rope. He stood there, completely still. He had heard the whole speech. He looked at Abby. He didn't say a word. He just touched the brim of his hat, turned, and walked back out into the morning sun. The implicit approval hung in the air. By the end of the second week, Arthur could write his name. Micah was a different story. He learned the letters quickly. His hands were steady, but his eyes were always guarded. He did the work, but he gave nothing of himself. He kept the wall up. On a Thursday, Abby pulled out a geography book. It was an old volume she had salvaged from Missouri. She opened it to a map of the Texas Panhandle and the Indian Territories to the north. Today, we are going to learn how to read a map, Abby said. She pointed to the winding lines. This is the Red River. These are the Caprock canyons. This shows where the land changes elevation. Micah looked at the map. For the first time, his mask slipped, his brow furrowed. He stared at the ink lines depicting the canyons. He shook his head, just slightly. Abby stopped. Is something wrong, Micah? He looked up at her. He hesitated. He had spent his whole life learning to keep his mouth shut around white people when they were talking about facts. The book is wrong, Micah said quietly. Wrong how? Micah pointed a calloused finger at a section of the map near the canyons. This says water is here. In August, there is no water here. The river goes underground. If a man follows this paper in the summer, he will die. He moved his finger north, and this pass. It says it is open. It is not. It was blocked by a rock slide 3 winters ago. The map is blind. Abby looked at the book. It was printed in New York by men who had never seen the dust of the Panhandle. She could have defended the book. She was the teacher. She was supposed to know best. That was the rule of the classroom. Instead, Abby closed the book. She pushed it aside. She took a blank slate. She handed it to Micah. She handed him the chalk. You're right, Abby said. The map is blind. So, open its eyes. Draw it for me. Micah stared at the chalk. He looked at Abby. He was searching her face for the trap, the condescension, the moment where she would remind him of his place. He found nothing but genuine curiosity and absolute respect. It was an implicit exchange of power. She was stepping down from the pedestal of the educator. She was acknowledging that the white man's ink did not hold the monopoly on truth. Micah took the chalk. He didn't draw boundaries. He didn't draw state lines. He drew the land as it lived. He drew the true path of the water. He marked the canyons with sharp, jagged strokes. This, Micah said, pointing to a ridge, this is called Pia to Yabai. Big mountain. Pia to Yabai, Abby repeated, testing the syllables in her mouth. She took her own slate and wrote the phonetic spelling down. Show me the next one. For the next hour, there was no teacher and no student. There were just two people sharing the world. Micah spoke in low, rhythmic tones, mapping out the veins of the earth he knew in his bones. Abby listened. She wrote down the Comanche names beside the English ones. She was teaching him how to navigate the white man's world of paper and ink. He was teaching her how to actually see the land she was standing on. When the lesson was over, Micah stood up. He wiped the chalk dust from his jeans. He looked at the slate Abby had filled with his words. "Thank you, Mrs. Preston," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. "Thank you, Micah," she replied. He walked out toward the bunkhouse. Abby sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet again. She looked out the window. She saw Silas by the corral, breaking a new colt. He was patient. He moved slow. He let the animal figure out the boundaries without forcing it to break. Abby realized something then. Silas Vance ran his ranch exactly the way she wanted to run her classroom. He didn't demand respect. He didn't force submission. He created a space where people could choose to stand up on their own. She traced her finger over the chalk letters on the slate. She had come here for one night of shelter. But looking around this quiet, scarred, beautiful place, she felt a terrifying, unfamiliar thought taking root in her chest. She was starting to feel at home. The Panhandle did not have a gentle autumn. The cold didn't arrive. It struck. By the third week of November, the wind coming off the plains was sharp enough to draw blood. The harvest was late. Silas had planted 60 acres of dent corn. It needed to be brought in before the first hard freeze, or it would rot in the field. It was a three-man job. Silas, Arthur, Micah. They worked from before sunrise until the light bled out of the sky. Abby watched them from the kitchen window. She saw the way Arthur favored his left knee. She saw the heavy, exhausted slump of Micah's shoulders when he walked toward the bunkhouse at night. She saw Silas. He never slumped, but his face was drawn tight, the skin pale beneath the dirt and windburn. The next morning, Abby finished washing the breakfast plates. She wiped down the oak table. Then she walked to the hall hook, took down her wool coat, and tied a scarf around her hair. She walked out the back door and straight into the north field. Silas was 50 yards down a row, snapping ears off the dry stalks and tossing them into a wooden wagon. He heard her boots crunching on the frost-heaved dirt. He stopped. He turned. He looked at her skirt. He looked at her bare hands. He looked at the biting wind whipping her scarf. "Kitchen's done," Abby said. Her breath plumed in the freezing air. Silas didn't tell her to go back inside. He didn't tell her this was men's work. He reached into the wagon bed, pulled out a spare pair of heavy canvas work gloves, and tossed them to her. Abby caught them. She pulled them on. They were massive. Her fingers swam in the fabric. She walked to the next row, grabbed a dry, razor-sharp stalk, snapped the ear of corn downward, and threw it into the wagon. They worked. There was no conversation. The wind stole the words anyway. The work was brutal, repetitive, mind-numbing. The dry leaves slashed at Abby's wrists, where the gloves ended. The dust coated her throat. Her lower back began to scream after the first hour. She did not stop. She did not complain. This was the language of the frontier. You didn't prove your worth with polite parlor talk. You proved it by how much weight you were willing to pull when the wagon was stuck in the mud. By sunset, Abby couldn't feel her fingers. She walked back to the house. Every step sent a jolt of pain up her spine. She went straight to the kitchen basin. She pumped the water. It was freezing. She pulled off the canvas gloves. Her hands were ruined. Blisters covered her palms. 3 of them had burst, leaving raw, weeping red circles. The dry corn leaves had sliced dozens of tiny, stinging paper cuts across her knuckles. She plunged her hands into the cold water. She bit her lip so hard. She tasted copper to keep from making a sound. The back door opened. Silas walked in. He smelled of cold air, dust, and sweat. He took off his hat. He walked toward the stove to pour his coffee. He saw her hands. He stopped. He looked at the bloody water in the basin. He looked at the raw meat of her palms. He didn't sigh. He didn't say, "I told you." It was too hard. He didn't offer a patronizing word of comfort. He set his tin cup down. He walked into his bedroom. A minute later, he came out. He walked to the basin. He placed a small, round tin on the wooden counter beside her. "Beef tallow and calendula," Silas said. His voice was low. "Rough. Boiled it down last spring. Put it on thick. Wrap them in clean cotton before you sleep." He didn't wait for a thank you. He turned, grabbed his coffee, and walked out to the porch. Abby stared at the little tin. She opened it. It smelled of earth and wax. It was a simple thing. But in that small tin was an ocean of implicit respect. He wasn't trying to fix her. He wasn't taking her agency away by forbidding her to work. He was simply giving her the tools to heal so she could choose to fight again tomorrow. She scooped out the salve. It burned, and then it settled into a deep, soothing warmth. Sarah was afraid of loud noises. She was afraid of sudden movements, but most of all, she was afraid of the horses. The child had spent 31 days on a rattling train and walking on muddy roads. The world was big, and she was very small. The massive quarter horses in Silas Corral, with their stamping hooves and snorting breath, terrified her. If she was playing in the yard and a horse walked by, Sarah would freeze. She would press her back flat against the house and hold her breath until the animal was gone. Silas noticed. He noticed everything. He didn't sit the child down for a stern talk about courage. He didn't pick her up and force her onto a saddle to break the fear out of her. That was how men out here usually handled fear. Through force. Silas handled it differently. On a Tuesday morning, he walked into the corral. He put a halter on a horse named Flower. She was 18 years old. Her coat was the color of old snow. She was half blind in her left eye and moved with the slow, arthritic grace of an old grandmother. Silas led Flower out of the corral. He walked her right up to the edge of the kitchen porch. He tied her lead rope to the sturdy oak post. He left her there. He didn't call Sarah out. He just went back to work. Sarah watched from the kitchen window. She stayed inside all morning. Flower just stood there. Occasionally, the old mare shifted her weight or swished her tail at a fly. She didn't rear. She didn't spook. She just breathed. At noon, Silas came back. He untied the horse, led her to water, and took her back to the corral. The next morning, Silas did it again. He tied Flower to the porch post. Sarah opened the kitchen door. She stood on the threshold, 10 feet away. The horse looked at her with a mild, milky eye. Sarah didn't move. Flower didn't move. Day 3. Day 4. Every single morning, the old white horse was there. It was a masterclass in silent education. Silas was teaching the child without ever speaking a word. The lesson was implicit. Safety cannot be commanded. It must be proven. Healing takes time, and you are allowed to take all the time you need. On the seventh day, Sarah stepped off the porch. Abby watched from the window, her heart in her throat. She gripped the edge of the sink. She wanted to run out. She wanted to pull her daughter back, but she forced herself to stand still. Sarah walked slowly, one tiny step at a time. She stopped 3 feet from the horse's nose. Flower lowered her massive head. She let out a long, soft breath that fluttered the loose hairs on Sarah's forehead. Sarah didn't run. On the 10th day, Silas was sitting on the porch bench, fixing a broken bridle strap. Flower was tied to the post. Sarah walked out the door. She held a withered, half-eaten apple in her hand. She walked straight up to the horse. She held her flat palm out. Her little hand was shaking. Flower stepped forward. The horse's velvety lips grazed the child's palm, picking up the apple with incredible gentleness. The crunching sound filled the quiet yard. Sarah giggled. She reached out with her other hand and pressed it flat against the horse white neck. Silas didn't look up from his leather strap. He didn't cheer. He didn't ruin the moment by making it a spectacle. He just kept working. But Abby, watching from the window, saw the faint, rare shadow of a smile touch the corners of his mouth. It was the 1st of December. Payday. The wind howled around the corners of the cabin. Supper was finished. Micah and Arthur had gone back to the bunkhouse. Sarah was asleep in the spare room. Abby was wiping down the stove. Silas was sitting at the table, a leather-bound ledger open in front of him. "Mrs. Preston," Silas said. Abby turned around. She wiped her hands on her apron. Silas reached into his vest pocket. He pulled out a small canvas pouch. He opened it and set 8 coins on the scarred wood of the table. Clack, clack, clack. They were heavy silver dollars, not paper script. "I can take paper, Mr. Vance," Abby said. "I know silver is hard to come by. Paper money is a promise made by men who lie for a living," Silas said flatly. "Following the Panic of '73, a greenback isn't worth the ink they print it with in half the stores out here. Silver is weight. Silver is true. You earned true money." Abby walked to the table. She looked at the 8 coins. It was the first money she had earned with her own hands in her entire life. It didn't belong to her father. It didn't belong to her husband's creditors. It was hers. She picked them up. They were cold. They felt like gravity. She looked across the table at Silas. He was already looking back down at his ledger. "Am I doing all right?" Abby asked. The question slipped out before she could stop it. It was a vulnerability she hadn't intended to show. The arrangement. "Is it working for you?" Silas stopped his pen. He didn't look up immediately. He was a man who weighed his words as carefully as he weighed his grain. He finally raised his eyes. "Arthur stood in the mercantile yesterday," Silas said. His voice was quiet. "A buyer from Chicago tried to shortchange him on a supply order, showed Arthur the receipt, told him the numbers added up." Abby held her breath. Arthur looked at the paper. Silas continued. He put his finger on the line. He read the price of salt out loud. Then he read the price of flour. He told the man he was short by $3.40. The buyer turned white. He paid him the difference. Silas closed the ledger. "Arthur read the paper," Silas said, his eyes locking onto hers. "No one will ever cheat that man again." "Yes, Mrs. Preston, the arrangement is working." He stood up, picked up his hat, and walked out into the freezing night. Abby stood in the quiet kitchen. She held the silver in her fist. She pressed it against her chest, right over her heart. For the first time in months, she felt a profound, unshakable sense of peace. A frontier town in the winter is an ugly thing. Caldwell, Kansas, was no exception. The mud from the autumn rains had frozen into jagged, bone-breaking ruts. The wooden boardwalks were slick with frost. The sky was the color of an old iron skillet. Silas drove the wagon into town on a Tuesday. They needed flour, coffee, and nails. Abby rode beside him on the buckboard. Sarah sat huddled in the back beneath a heavy buffalo robe. The ride had been quiet, comfortable. But the moment the wagon wheels hit the main street of Caldwell, the air changed. Abby felt it immediately. It was a physical weight, the creeping, suffocating pressure of a small-town-esque judgment. A group of women standing outside the post office stopped talking as the wagon rolled past. They turned their heads. They didn't smile. They just watched with flat, calculating eyes. Two men leaning against the livery stable spat tobacco juice into the frozen dirt and muttered something to each other. Rumors did not die on the plains. They fermented. They grew toxic in the dark. The story of the ruined widow from Missouri had not faded. It had mutated. Now, she wasn't just a woman with a dead husband's debt. She was a woman living unchaperoned on a Bachelor S ranch. Abby kept her spine straight. She looked straight ahead. She would not give them the satisfaction of a flinch. Silas pulled the wagon up to the mercantile. He tied off the brake. He didn't look at the staring women. He didn't look at the whispering men. He just stepped down and offered Abby his hand. She took it. His grip was solid, an anchor in a rising tide. They walked into the store. The warm air smelled of dried apples and kerosene. Mr. Higgins was behind the counter. He looked up, saw Abby, and his face instantly hardened. "Vance?" Higgins said, nodding curtly to Silas. He ignored Abby completely. "Flour, 50 pounds. 10 pounds of Arbuckle coffee. Box of framing nails," Silas ordered. His voice was level. Before Higgins could move, the bell above the door chimed. The man who walked in did not belong in Caldwell. He wore a dark wool suit tailored to fit. A silk vest gleamed beneath his coat. A heavy gold watch chain draped across his stomach. His boots were polished to a mirror shine. He was Josiah Blackwood. Blackwood owned the Caldwell First National Bank. He owned the land office. He owned half the town council. He was the frontier's new apex predator. He didn't use a gun. He used ink. "Silas," Blackwood said. His smile was wide, warm, entirely fake. "Good to see you in town. I was hoping to catch you." "Blackwood," Silas said. He didn't offer his hand. Blackwood's eyes slid over to Abby. The smile grew a fraction wider. It was the look a butcher gives a prime cut of meat. "And this must be the infamous Mrs. Preston," Blackwood said, removing his hat and bowing his head slightly. "Word travels fast, ma'am. Missouri is a long way off. A tragic business. What happened to your husband? Terrible debts. Terrible shame." Abby felt the blood rush to her ears. He was doing it on purpose, saying it loud enough for Higgins and the two other customers in the store to hear, weaponizing her trauma in public. "My past is my own business, Mr. Blackwood," Abby said. Her voice was ice. Of course," Blackwood chuckled smoothly. He turned back to Silas. "Silas, my friend, I need a word. Concerning that parcel of land you own on the Eastern Ridge. It's not for sale," Silas said. "Everything is for sale, Silas, especially now. The railroad surveyors are moving through the territory. That ridge is the only logical grade for a spur line. It says progress. I am offering you double the market rate." "No," Blackwood sighed. He pulled a silver cigar case from his pocket, turning it over in his clean, manicured hands. "That's unfortunate," Blackwood murmured. His voice dropped. Just between the two men, but Abby heard every word. "Because my clerks were going through some old ledgers this week. Seems there's a discrepancy. A loan from 1874. $400. For winter feed. The bank has no record of the repayment," Silas, jaw locked. "I paid that back in cash, to your clerk." 5 years ago. Did you? Blackwood feigned surprise. Well, my clerk from back then moved to Chicago, and I can't seem to locate the receipt. So, on paper, you owe the bank $400, plus 5 years of interest. That's a heavy burden, Silas. It could ruin a man. Force him to sell his land at auction. Blackwood paused. He looked pointedly at Abby. And it would be a shame, Blackwood added softly, for a man of your standing to face a foreclosure, especially now, with the town already talking so loudly about the company you keep. People don't trust a man who harbors scandalous women. They might not be sympathetic if the bank calls your note. He was squeezing, using Abby as leverage, trying to make Silas see her as a liability. Silas didn't blink. He stepped 1 inch closer to Blackwood. The banker was a tall man, but Silas seemed to eclipse the light in the room. "Send your men," Silas said. His voice was a low, terrifying rumble. "Send your sheriff. Send whoever you want. But if you speak about this woman again in my presence, you'll need more than a bank to put your jaw back together." Blackwood's smile finally cracked. He took a step back. "We'll be in touch, Vance," Blackwood said stiffly. He put his hat on and walked out the door. The ride back to the ranch was suffocating. The freezing air felt heavy. Sarah had fallen asleep in the back, lulled by the rocking wagon. Silas stared straight ahead at the road. He drove the team with mechanical precision. Abby sat beside him. Her hands were twisted tightly in her lap. The guilt was a physical ache in her chest. She had brought this to his door. Her ruin had become a weapon used against him. "He's lying," Abby said quietly. The wagon wheels ground against the frozen dirt. "About the receipt. He's lying to force you out." "I know," Silas said. "You can't prove you paid it. If he takes it to the circuit judge, they'll rule in favor of the bank's ledger." "I know," Silas repeated. Abby closed her eyes. "I will leave. Tomorrow. If I'm not on the ranch, he loses half his leverage. The town will stop talking. You can fight the debt without me dragging your name down." Silas pulled back hard on the reins. The wagon jerked to a halt in the middle of the empty plains. The sudden silence was deafening. Silas turned to her. He didn't look angry. He looked fiercely, deeply serious. "Mrs. Preston," he said, "do you think I'm a coward?" Abby blinked, stunned. "No, of course not." "Then do not insult me by suggesting I would throw a woman and a child to the wolves to save myself. Some gossip," Silas said. "This is my land. You are under my roof. Blackwood wants the ridge. He'll find a way to squeeze me whether you are here or not. You are not my liability. You are just his excuse." He snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward again. He didn't ask her for details about Missouri. He didn't ask her to defend herself. He simply refused to let her carry the blame for another man's greed. That evening, the threat became physical. Dusk was falling. The sky was bleeding purple and bruised gray. Abby was in the kitchen, lighting the lamps. Micah walked in through the back door. He moved silently, like smoke. He didn't take off his hat. "Boss," Micah said. Silas looked up from the table. "2 riders," Micah said. "North Ridge. They aren't pushing cattle. They aren't passing through. They've been sitting up there for an hour, watching the house with field glasses." Silas stood up. He walked to the gun cabinet in the corner. He opened it and pulled out a Winchester repeating rifle. He checked the action. The metallic clack-clack sounded loud in the quiet room. "Arthur," Silas called out. Arthur appeared from the bunkhouse. "Stay by the door." "Keep the shotgun loaded," Silas commanded. Silas commanded. He walked out into the gathering dark. Abby watched from the window. She saw the distant silhouettes of the riders on the ridge. Intimidation. Blackwood was sending a message. "I can see you. I can touch you whenever I want." Abby felt the familiar icy grip of panic. The same panic she had felt when the sheriff hammered the notice on her door in Missouri. The system was coming for her again. It was coming for the only safe place she had left. She turned away from the window. She walked into her bedroom. She opened the wardrobe. At the bottom sat her battered leather traveling bag. She pulled it out. She undid the heavy brass buckles. Beneath her spare dresses, beneath Sarah's extra shoes, lay a thick stack of legal pads, bound in brown leather, filled with dense, looping, cursive ink. Abigail Preston was not just a schoolteacher. Before she married Thomas, before she moved to the small town in Missouri, she was Abigail Webb, daughter of Judge Samuel Webb, federal circuit judge of St. Louis. She had grown up in a house built on law books. While other girls learned embroidery, Abby sat in her father's study, reading case files, summarizing precedents, and learning the intricate, brutal machinery of American jurisprudence. Thomas had hated that she knew the law. He had forbidden her from speaking of it. He wanted a wife, not a partner. So, she had buried it. But Thomas was dead, and Blackwood had just started a war. Abby pulled the heavy leather binders out. She carried them into the kitchen. She set them on the oak table with a heavy thud. Silas walked back inside. The cold rolled off his coat. They rode off, just scouts, trying to rattle us. He looked at the table. He looked at the leather binders. Then he looked at Abby. "What is this?" Silas asked. Abby stood tall. The trembling was gone. The school teacher was gone. The judge's daughter had woken up. "This," Abby said, her voice ringing with absolute clarity, "is how we stop him." Explicitly. Silas frowned. "Blackwood owns the town, Sheriff. He owns the local judge." "I don't care about the local judge," Abby fired back. She opened the first binder. The pages were filled with statutes and case laws. "Mr. Vance, I grew up in a federal courthouse. My father was a circuit judge. I know the law better than Josiah Blackwood's entire payroll." She pointed a finger at the page. "The law in this territory is corrupt. The men in town use it like a sword to cut down anyone who stands in their way. They use it to take homes from widows and land from honest men. But my father taught me something." She looked Silas dead in the eye. "He taught me that a good law isn't a sword for the powerful. It is a shield for the powerless. Blackwood is committing fraud. He is using inside information regarding the railroad to extort your land. That violates the Federal Land Speculation Act of 1875. If we can prove he knew about the railroad spur before it was public, his claim to your debt is nullified, and he goes to federal prison." Silas stared at her. For the first time since she had met him, he looked genuinely, profoundly shocked. He looked at the neat, fierce handwriting on the pages. Then he looked back at the woman standing in his kitchen. He didn't see a broken widow. He didn't see a charity case. He saw a general laying out a battle map. A slow, deep respect settled into his eyes. "All right," Silas said quietly. He leaned over the table, bracing his heavy, calloused hands on either side of her legal pads. "Show me how the shield works." The kitchen smelled like roasted coffee and chalk dust. It was Wednesday morning. The day after Blackwood had stood in the mercantile and threatened them. The day after Abby had opened her leather binders and laid out a war plan. But this morning the law books were stacked neatly on the sideboard. The war could wait for the postmaster. Right now, it was time for school. Arthur sat at the oak table. Micah sat beside him. Sarah sat at the end, her small legs swinging under the chair. Abby stood at the head of the table. She had written 4 words on her slateboard. "Arthur," Abby said. Her voice was calm, steady. "Read it for me." Arthur leaned forward. He squinted. The reading glasses Abby had traded for in town sat heavy on his broad nose. He placed his massive calloused finger under the first word. In her ent, Arthur read slowly. He paused. He sounded out the next word. Rights. Inherent rights. He looked up. I can read the letters, Mrs. Preston, but I don't know the meaning. This was the work. This was the real work. Abby set her chalk down. She rested her hands on the table. An inherent right, Arthur, is something you are born with, Abby said. The room was perfectly still. Even Micah was watching her closely. It is not a gift. It is not something the government gives you. It is not something a rich man in a bank allows you to have. She looked at Arthur. Then she looked at Micah. For a long time, the law in this country said only certain men had these rights. White men. Men with property. But the law is just a rule made by men, and men are often wrong. The truth is, your right to be treated with dignity, your right to your own labor, and your right to stand on this earth and not be cheated. You were born with those. They belong to you. If a man tries to take them, he isn't just breaking a rule. He is stealing. Arthur stared at the slate board. He traced the word inherent with his finger. He didn't say anything for a long time. He didn't have to. The lesson was landing deep in his bones. They take it anyway, Micah said quietly. He didn't sound angry. He just sounded tired. They write a paper. They point a gun. And the right is gone. Abby turned to the young man. They take the land, Micah. They take the money. They can even take your life. But they cannot make you less of a man unless you agree to it. That is what inherent means. It means the dignity stays inside you, no matter what they do to your outside. It was an explicit truth, stated plainly in a warm kitchen on a freezing morning. It was a truth that could get a person killed in some parts of the territory. But in this house, it was the foundation they were building on. Abby tapped the slate. Write it down, both of you, 10 times. Memorize the shape of it. By afternoon, the warmth of the kitchen was a memory. The wind had shifted. It blew straight down from the Dakotas. It carried the smell of ice and dead grass. Silas was a mile south of the house. He was working the fence line. It was a new kind of fence, barbed wire. They called it the devil's rope. Silas hated the stuff. It was cruel to the cattle. It tore the hides off horses. But wood was scarce, and a man had to mark his boundaries if he wanted to keep the land grabbers out. He was stretching a line of wire between 2 cedar posts. The metal was stiff from the cold. He gripped the heavy iron stretchers, pulling the wire tight. He was thinking about Abby. He was thinking about the way she had looked at him last night, her hands resting on a stack of federal law books, entirely fearless. She was a woman who had been stripped of everything, yet she was ready to go to war for a man she barely knew. He pulled the stretcher handle back. Hard. The wire was defective. A microfracture in the steel, made brittle by the frost. It didn't just break. It snapped. The tension released like a gunshot. The wire whipped back. Before Silas could flinch, the heavy, rusted barb dragged violently across the palm of his right hand. It tore through his heavy leather work glove like paper. It tore through his skin. It bit deep into the muscle. Silas dropped the stretcher. He didn't shout, just gritted his teeth and grabbed his right wrist. The blood came fast, dark and heavy. It soaked the ruined leather of the glove. It dripped onto the frozen Texas dirt. Black spots danced at the edge of his vision for a second. It was a bad cut, a dirty cut. Out here, a dirty cut could mean lockjaw. It could mean losing the hand. It could mean death. He clamped his left hand over the wound. He turned and started the long walk back to the house. Abby was at the stove when the back door opened. She turned. wiping her hands on her apron. Coffee is, she stopped. Silas stood in the doorway. His face was gray. His jaw was locked tight. He was holding his right hand against his chest. Blood was dripping from his fingers, hitting the clean oak floorboards in heavy, wet drops. He didn't ask for help. He didn't say a word. He just walked straight to the kitchen basin. Abby didn't scream. She didn't freeze. The frontier didn't allow for fragile nerves. She moved. "Sit," she commanded. Silas didn't argue. He sat heavily in the chair beside the basin. Abby grabbed a clean flour sack. She grabbed the bottle of carbolic acid from the high shelf. She pumped the iron handle of the sink until the cold water rushed out. "Let me see it," she said. Silas slowly peeled his left hand away. The leather glove was fused to the wound with blood. Abby didn't hesitate. She took his wrist. Her hands were small, but her grip was absolute. She didn't treat him like a piece of glass. She treated him like a man who needed saving. She took a pair of shears and cut the glove away. The wound was ugly, jagged, running from the base of his thumb straight across his palm. "This is going to burn," Abby said quietly. "Do it," Silas grunted. She poured the carbolic acid over the open flesh. Silas' entire body went rigid. His breath hissed through his teeth. The muscles in his forearm bunched like coiled steel. But he didn't pull away. That was the implicit truth of the moment. He didn't pull away. Silas Vance was a man who trusted no one. He had spent 7 years building a wall around himself. He handled his own problems. He suffered his own pain. But right now, bleeding in a quiet kitchen, he surrendered total control to her. Abby felt it. She felt the weight of his trust. She washed the wound with cold water. Her fingers were gentle now, deft, moving with a practiced rhythm. She took a needle and silk thread from her mending kit. "I have to close it," she murmured, keeping her eyes on his hand, "or it will tear open every time you grip a shovel." "Close it," he said. His voice was strained, thick with pain. She stitched the skin. 6 neat, tight loops. She worked quickly. Every time the needle pierced his flesh, she felt a phantom ache in her own chest. When she was done, she wrapped his hand tightly in clean white strips of the flour sack. She tied the knot. She didn't let go of his hand immediately. She stood there, her fingers resting lightly over his bandaged palm. His hand was massive beneath hers, warm, rough, alive. She looked up. Silas was looking at her. They were inches apart. There were no grand declarations of love. There was no sweeping romance. There was only the smell of iodine, copper blood, and strong coffee. But in the quiet of that kitchen, holding a wounded man's hand, an unspoken vow was made. "I will not let you bleed alone." "Thank you," Silas said softly. "Keep it dry," Abby whispered back. She finally let his hand go. That night, the house was silent. Sarah was asleep. The fire in the stove had burned down to glowing red embers. Abby couldn't sleep. The adrenaline from the afternoon was still humming in her blood. She wrapped her heavy wool shawl around her shoulders and walked out into the kitchen. She saw the back door was slightly ajar. She walked over and pushed it open. Silas was sitting on the wooden bench on the porch. He was wearing his heavy canvas coat. His bandaged hand rested on his thigh. He was looking out at the endless black ocean of the prairie. The sky was violently clear. A million stars burned like cold white fire. Abby stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit her like a physical blow, but she didn't retreat. She walked over and sat down on the bench beside him. She didn't ask what he was doing out here. She just joined him in the silence. They sat that way for a long time. The wind rustled the dry grass. "It's going to freeze hard tonight," Silas said finally. His voice was low, merging perfectly with the dark. I put extra blankets on Sarah's bed, Abby replied. Silence returned, but it wasn't heavy. It was a comfortable, shared thing. Then Silas shifted on the bench. He looked down at his bandaged hand. When Margaret died, Silas said, the name hung in the freezing air. It was the first time he had spoken his wife's name out loud to her. Abby didn't turn her head. She just listened. When she died, the house got very quiet, Silas continued. His words were slow, deliberate, like a man walking across thin ice. It wasn't a sudden quiet. It was the kind of quiet that creeps in, like water filling a sinking boat. You don't notice it until you're drowning in it. He took a slow, deep breath. She had typhoid. It took 3 weeks. The last week, she didn't know who I was. She just looked right through me. He paused. After we buried her, I came back to this house. I sat at that kitchen table, and I realized I didn't know how to be a person anymore, not without her. Abby pulled her shawl tighter. Her heart ached for the man sitting next to her. She knew that exact, terrifying emptiness. So, you stopped trying, Abby said softly. I just worked, Silas said. I worked until I couldn't think. I worked until my hands bled. If I was tired enough, I didn't have to feel the empty space in the room. I lived like that for 7 years. I thought I was doing fine. I thought I had beaten it. He turned his head. He looked at Abby. The starlight caught the deep lines around his eyes. And then you stood in the mud on my road, Silas said, with your chin up, asking for one night of shelter. And suddenly the house was full of noise again. The smell of cooking, the sound of a child laughing at a horse, the sound of Arthur trying to read. He looked back down at his hands. I'm terrified, Abby, because I know that if you leave, the quiet will come back, and I don't think I can survive it a second time. It was a profound, devastating confession. A man carved from granite, admitting he was afraid of the dark. Abby didn't offer him pity. She didn't tell him everything would be all right. That was a lie people told children. She turned on the bench. She faced him fully. Silas, Abby said. Her voice was strong, carrying the weight of her own survival. He looked up. My husband lied to me for 10 years, Abby said, speaking her own truth into the cold night. He gambled away our home. He gambled away my daughter's future. When he died, I felt so much shame I thought it would crush my chest. I felt broken. She reached out. She didn't take his hand. She just laid her palm flat against his heavy canvas sleeve, an anchor. But I learned something on the walk to Caldwell, Abby said. And here, she delivered the lesson she had paid for with everything she owned. Grief doesn't make us broken merchandise, Silas. Pain doesn't mean we are ruined. It is simply proof that we dared to love something more than we loved ourselves. You loved Margaret. You survived the losing of her. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you capable of carrying a heavier load. Silas stared at her. His chest rose and fell with a slow, shuddering breath. You don't have to be afraid of the quiet anymore, Abby said softly. Because I'm not going anywhere. We are going to fight Blackwood. We are going to win. And then we are going to wake up and make coffee. Silas looked at the woman beside him. He saw the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. He saw the courage that had carried her through a storm with exactly $4.37 in her pocket. He didn't say, I love you. The frontier didn't demand pretty words. He simply nodded, slowly. All right, Silas said. They sat together on the porch for another hour. Two scarred, resilient people, watching the stars burn over the Texas plains. They didn't need to speak again. The silence was no longer empty. It was full. The winter did not ease. It dug in. It was a Friday when the letters came. Micah had ridden into Caldwell for horseshoes and salt. He returned by midday. He walked into the kitchen, his canvas slicker dripping melting snow onto the floorboards. He didn't speak. He just reached into his coat and placed 3 folded pieces of paper on the oak table. Abby wiped her hands on her apron. She picked up the first letter. It was from Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith's wife. She had been sending her 2 boys out to the ranch on Tuesday mornings for reading lessons. The handwriting was tight. Stiff. Dear Mrs. Preston. Due to a change in circumstances, the boys will no longer require your instruction. We thank you for your time. Abby opened the second, from the baker. Similar words. She opened the third. The same. A boycott. Clean, polite, and absolute. Josiah Blackwood had done his work. He had poisoned the town well. He hadn't just attacked Silas's credit. He had attacked Abby's character. And in 1878, a woman's character was the only currency she had. Without it, she was a ghost. Sarah was sitting by the stove, playing with a wooden horse Silas had whittled for her. She looked up. Are the Gable boys coming next week, Mama? I saved them some cornbread. Abby folded the letters. She pressed her thumb hard against the paper. She walked over and knelt beside her daughter. No. Sarah, they aren't coming. Are they sick? No. Abby looked at her child. This was the moment, the brutal, necessary education of a girl growing up in a hard world. People are afraid, Sarah, Abby said, her voice steady. The explicit truth had to be spoken. Mr. Blackwood spread lies about us, and the people in town chose to believe the lies because it is easier to agree with a powerful man than to stand up to him. When people are afraid, they punish the person standing closest to the fire. They took the boys away to punish me. Sarah asked, brow furrowed. But you didn't do anything wrong. I know, Abby said. But the law of the crowd doesn't care about right or wrong. It only cares about power. Remember this. Never let fear make your decisions for you. It turns good people into cowards. Sarah nodded slowly. She looked down at the wooden horse. The back door opened. Silas stepped in. He saw the letters on the table. He saw Abby kneeling by the stove. He walked over. He picked up the letters. He read them. Abby watched his face. She braced herself for the anger. She expected him to shout, to curse Blackwood, to saddle his horse and ride into town with the Winchester. He did none of those things. Silas set the letters down. His face turned to stone. The warmth that had been building between them since the night on the porch vanished. The shutters slammed down over his eyes. I have fences to check, Silas said. He turned around and walked right back out into the cold. The silence began. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a rotting thing. For the next 4 days, Silas barely spoke. He left the house before the sun came up. He rode the far ridges. He broke ice in the cattle troughs. He mended wire until his hands bled through his bandages. He came back long after dark, ate his supper in the corner of the kitchen without looking at Abby, and went to his room. He thought he was doing the right thing. This was the implicit tragedy of Silas Vance. When a wolf is circling the den, the hound doesn't stay inside to comfort the pups. He goes out into the snow. He patrols the perimeter. He stands in the freezing wind so the cold won't touch the ones inside. Silas was trying to protect her. He was trying to figure out a way to break Blackwood's hold on the town without breaking her in the process. He didn't have the words to explain the battle in his head, so he offered silence. But Abby didn't see a guard dog. She saw Thomas. Her late husband had used silence as a weapon. When Thomas was gambling away their savings, he had stopped talking to her. He had grown cold, distant. He had shut her out to hide his shame. To Abigail Preston, a man's silence did not mean protection. It meant betrayal. It meant she was being cast out. The trauma of Missouri was a ghost living in her bones, and Silas' silence had just woken it up. By Tuesday evening, the air in the kitchen was thick enough to choke on. Abby was washing dishes. Silas sat at the table, staring blindly at his ledger. He hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. Abby dropped a tin cup into the wash basin. It hit with a loud, metallic clatter. Silas flinched. "Don't do that," Abby said. Her voice was sharp. "Brittle?" Silas asked. Finally, looking up, "Don't sit there and pretend you aren't thinking it." Abby turned around. Her hands were shaking, dripping soapy water onto the floor. "You read those letters. You know what the town is saying. You know Blackwood is squeezing you because of me. Say it, Silas. Have the decency to say it out loud." Silas stood up. He looked exhausted. The lines on his face seemed carved an inch deep. He didn't know what she needed. He thought she was crumbling under the weight of the town's hatred. He thought he needed to offer her an escape. "I know it's hard on you," Silas said, keeping his voice low. "The whispers, the boycotts. You aren't used to this kind of dirt. Maybe it's too much. You don't have to stay and suffer their cruelty, Abby. You don't have to bear this." It was a clumsy offering of mercy. But Abby heard it through the filter of her own scars. "You don't have to stay." The word "whack" echoed in her head. She didn't hear a man trying to shield her from pain. She heard a man asking her to leave. She heard Thomas abandoning her to the wolves so he could save himself. Her heart closed like a fist. The walls of her pride shot up 10 feet high and thick with iron. "I understand," Abby said. Her voice went completely flat. The schoolteacher was back, cold and precise. "I am a liability. I am costing you your reputation and your land. You want the debt dropped. You want the town to look at you the same way they did before I walked up your road." Silas took a step forward. "That isn't what I said. It is what you meant." Abby untied her apron. She let it fall to the floor, and your silence for the last 4 days confirmed it. "I told you on the first night I wouldn't be a charity case, Mr. Vance. And I won't be a burden. I will pack our things. We will be gone by morning." She waited for him to stop her. She waited for him to cross the kitchen, grab her by the shoulders, and tell her she was wrong. But Silas was paralyzed. His own trauma held him in place. Margaret had died in that room, and he couldn't stop it. Now Abby was leaving, and he couldn't stop it. He believed he was toxic. He believed the world broke everything he tried to hold on to. If she left, she might be safer. He just looked at her, his jaw tight, his eyes dark with an agony he couldn't voice. He stepped back. He let her pass. The darkest hour of a life doesn't always come with a dramatic storm. Sometimes it comes with the quiet folding of clothes. Abby pulled the battered leather bag from the wardrobe. She laid it on the bed. Sarah was sitting on the edge of the mattress. The 9-year-old child watched her mother. She didn't cry. She didn't throw a tantrum. She simply stood up, walked to the small dresser, and started pulling out her woolen stockings. It was an implicit, devastating display of trauma. A child so accustomed to instability, so used to the floor falling out from under her, that packing her life into a bag at a moment's notice was just a reflex. Abby saw it. It broke her heart cleanly in two. She reached out and pulled Sarah against her chest. She buried her face in the child's hair. "I'm sorry, baby," she whispered into the dark room. "I'm so sorry. I thought we were safe here." Out in the hallway, Silas stood in the shadows. He watched the woman and the child through the crack in the door. He saw the defeat in the curve of Abby's spine. He had done this. His silence had done this. He turned away. He walked into his own room and shut the door. Abby was buckling the thick leather straps of the bag when the knock came. It wasn't Silas. The knock was heavy, rhythmic. "Come in," Abby said, wiping a stray tear from her cheek. The door opened. Arthur stepped into the room. The giant 60-year-old ranch hand seemed to fill the entire space. He was holding his slate board in his massive left hand. He didn't stop at the threshold. He stepped all the way in and closed the door behind him. He stood directly in front of it, a mountain of a man blocking the exit. It was a profound, implicit shift in power. An older black man, in 1878, physically blocking the door of a white woman. It was a terrifying risk in the outside world. But in this house, under this roof, it was an act of absolute equality and desperate love. He was her student, but tonight he was her elder. Abby looked up, startled. "Arthur, I need to get the wagon ready." "No, ma'am," Arthur said. His voice was a low rumble, steady as a heartbeat. "You don't." "Arthur, please move. It is decided." "By who?" Arthur asked. He looked at the packed bag. He looked at Sarah, who was sitting quietly on the bed. Then he looked at Abby. "Did he tell you to leave?" Abby didn't have to say it. I heard his silence. "I know what it means." Arthur sighed. It was a heavy, ancient sound. He lifted the slate board. On it, written in his own blocky, uneven chalk letters, was the word patience. "You taught me this word last week," Arthur said. He tapped the slate with his finger. "You sat beside me for a month. When I broke the chalk, when I forgot the letters, when I wanted to quit because I thought I was too stupid. You didn't let me quit. You told me reading takes time." He lowered the slate. He looked straight into Abby S. eyes. "Mrs. Preston," Arthur said, his voice rising with explicit, unvarnished truth. "A man can learn his letters in a month, but learning to open a locked heart takes a lifetime. That man in the other room, he hasn't spoken a soft word to a living soul in 7 years. His heart has been frozen solid. Now you come along and you start melting the ice. Do you know how much it hurts when frozen blood starts moving again?" Abby stared at him. The breath caught in her throat. "You are judging him by the sins of the men back in Missouri," Arthur said gently. "You are listening to the ghosts in your own head, teacher. You aren't listening to him." "He didn't say anything, Arthur," Abby whispered. Her voice broke. "When I told him I was leaving, he didn't try to stop me. Because he thinks he is the curse," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "He thinks the boycott, the banker, the trouble. He thinks he brought it on you. He is letting you go because he thinks you are better off without him. He is a fool, a damn fool. But he is not a coward, and he is not throwing you away." Arthur stepped aside. He pulled the door open. He pointed down the dark hallway toward Silas's closed door. "You taught me to be patient with a book," Arthur said. The profound humanistic lesson hung in the quiet air. Why can't you be patient with a man? You taught me how to read the paper. Now go read the man. Arthur didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked out of the room, his heavy boots fading down the hall. Abby stood frozen beside the bed. "You are listening to the ghosts in your own head." Arthur S. words hit her like a physical blow. She looked at the packed leather bag. She had almost let her past destroy her future. She had almost let Thomas Cross win from beyond the grave by letting his lies dictate how she saw a good man. She touched the brass buckle of the bag. Then she unbuckled it. She turned to Sarah. "Take your boots off, baby." Sarah looked up, confused but hopeful. "We aren't leaving." "No," Abby said. The cold, brittle shell around her heart cracked open, letting the warm air in. "We aren't running away. I have a lesson to finish." Abby stepped out of the bedroom. She walked down the dark hallway. She didn't knock on Silas's door. She pushed it open. The door hinges didn't creak. Silas kept everything oiled. Abby pushed the door open. The bedroom was dark, lit only by the pale moonlight cutting through the frost on the window pane. Silas was sitting in a ladder-back chair in the corner. He was fully dressed. His coat was still on. He was staring at the floor. He didn't look up when the door opened. He just braced himself. "The wagon is out front," Silas said. His voice was a hollow, scraping sound. "I'll hitch the team. I can take you as far as Dodge. You can catch a train back east." Abby stepped into the room. She closed the door behind her. The click of the latch was louder than a gunshot in the quiet house. "I unpacked the bag," Abby said. Silas' head snapped up. Even in the dark, she could see the sudden, desperate confusion in his eyes. He stopped. "Abby," he started. "No. You listen to me first." Abby interrupted. Her voice was shaking, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the sheer force of holding her ground. "You listen to me, Silas Vance." He stopped. He stood perfectly still. "My husband died and left me with nothing," Abby said, firing the words into the dark. But the money wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence. For 3 years before he died, he barely spoke to me. When he was losing our money, he shut me out. He built a wall of silence so he wouldn't have to look at his own shame. He made me feel like a ghost in my own house. Silas took a half step forward. The realization hit him like a physical blow. "So when you stopped talking," Abby continued, her chest heaving, "when you walk out of the kitchen and refuse to look at me for 4 days, I don't see a man trying to protect me. I see a man discarding me. I see a man who considers me a burden." "That isn't true," Silas said. The words tore out of him. "God, Abby, that isn't true." "Then what is it?" she demanded. This was the explicit demand for emotional honesty. The frontier required people to be tough, but toughness without truth was just a shell. "Tell me." Silas looked at her. He looked at the woman who had brought light back into his rotting house. "I thought I was the curse," Silas whispered. "Margaret died in this room. My hands couldn't save her. Now you are here, and the town turns on you. The banker comes for you. Everything I try to hold on to gets broken." I went quiet because I was trying to figure out how to fight Blackwood without the crossfire hitting you, and I couldn't find a way. He looked down at his boots. The big, scarred man looked utterly defeated. "I thought if I let you leave, you would be safe," Silas said. "I thought you were better off without the trouble I brought." Abby closed the distance between them. She stopped 1 inch from his chest. She didn't reach for him. She forced him to look her in the eye. "Silas," Abby said, her voice dropping into a fierce, absolute certainty, "I decide what is too much trouble for me. Not you." It wasn't a clear declaration of agency. She was not a damsel. She was a partner. "You don't get to martyr yourself to save me," Abby said. "You don't get to make my choices for me. If we are going to fight, we fight together. If we are going to lose, we lose together. But you do not ever shut me out again. Do you understand me?" Silas looked down into her eyes. The ice in his chest finally, completely shattered. The relief was so sharp it almost brought him to his knees. He didn't offer a poetic apology. He just nodded. "I understand," he said. "Good," Abby said. She took a deep breath. The schoolteacher was back. The judge's daughter was awake. "Now come out to the kitchen. We have a war to plan, and we are losing daylight." The oak table was covered in leather-bound ledgers. Abby had the kerosene lamp turned up high. The yellow light washed over the dense, handwritten pages of federal statutes. Silas sat across from her. He had a fresh cup of coffee in his hand. He didn't look tired anymore. He looked focused. Micah was standing by the back door, listening quietly in the shadows. "Josiah Blackwood is a wealthy man in a small pond," Abby said. tracing her finger down a page. He operates like a king because the local sheriff and the local judge owe him money. If you try to fight him in Caldwell, you will lose. He owns the board. So we flip the board, Silas said. Exactly. Abby looked up. We don't fight him on local debt law. We fight him on federal speculation law. She turned the ledger around so Silas could see the page. It was dense with legal jargon, but she translated it with brutal efficiency. This was the explicit education, the weaponizing of knowledge. In 1875, Congress passed an act regarding the expansion of the railroads, Abby explained. The government realized that local bankers were bribing surveyors to find out where the tracks were going. The bankers would then buy the land from local farmers for pennies, knowing the railroad would pay them thousands for it a month later. It's called insider speculation, and it is a federal crime. Silas looked at the book. Then he looked at her. Blackwood told me the surveyors were in the territory. He told me the ridge was the only logical grade. Did the town know? Abby asked. No. It hasn't been printed in the papers. It's not public. Then he showed his hand, Abby said, tapping the table. He used privileged government information to try and extort a landowner. That isn't a local civil dispute over a missing $400 receipt. That is federal fraud. Micah stepped out of the shadows. How do you prove it? We need a federal judge, Abby said. Someone outside of Blackwood's payroll. Someone who answers to Washington, not to the First National Bank of Caldwell. The closest federal courthouse is in Amarillo, Silas said. His mind was already moving to the logistics, the miles, the terrain. It's a 3-day ride in a wagon. 2 if we push the horses to the breaking point. Then we push them, Abby said. She closed the ledger. She looked at Silas. She was waiting for the pushback. She was waiting for the traditional frontier response. This is men's business. You stay here with the child. I will take the books to the judge. That was how the world worked. Men went to war. Women kept the home fires burning. Silas didn't say that. He looked at the heavy leather books. He looked at the fierce, brilliant woman sitting across from him. He knew his own limits. He could shoot straight. He could break a horse. But he couldn't navigate a federal courtroom. He couldn't speak the language of the men in black robes. Pack your bags, Silas said. Abby blinked. You're taking me? I'm not taking you, Silas corrected quietly. It was a massive, implicit shift in power. You are taking me. It's your battlefield, Abby. I'm just the escort. Abby felt a sudden, hot prickle of tears behind her eyes. She swallowed them down. She nodded once. Micah, Silas called out. Boss, saddle the roan. Hitch the strongest team to the light buckboard. We leave in an hour. The plains of the Texas Panhandle were not meant for fast travel in December. The wind was a constant physical opponent. It howled across the flat earth, throwing freezing dust into their eyes and teeth. Silas drove the team. Abby sat beside him on the wooden bench, wrapped in 2 wool blankets. Micah rode ahead as an outrider, his rifle resting across his saddle pommel. They had left Sarah with Arthur, who had sworn on his life to keep the child safe and the doors barred. They rode hard. They stopped only to water the horses and switched the team. On the afternoon of the second day, the buckboard hit a hidden frost heave. The sound was like a cannon shot. The wagon lurched violently to the left. The front wheel had dropped into a rut, wedged deep in the frozen mud. The horses whinnied in panic, pulling against the traces. Silas jumped down. He waded into the freezing mud. Micah rode back and dismounted. They assessed the damage. The wheel wasn't broken, but the axle was buried deep. We have to lift it, Silas shouted over the wind. Micah, Get a lever under the axle. I'll take the spokes. Silas looked up at Abby. She was already unwrapping her blankets. In a lesser story, the man would have told the woman to sit tight, to not dirty her dress, to let the men handle the heavy lifting. Silas didn't say a word. He just stepped back and waited. Abby climbed down. The freezing mud instantly soaked through her leather boots. She didn't complain. She waded to the front of the wagon. Silas handed her the heavy leather reins. When I yell, you crack them, Silas said. You pull hard left. Don't let them step back, or the axle snaps. You hold them, Abby. I have them, she said. She wrapped the rough leather around her raw, blistered hands. She braced her boots in the mud. She was a 38-year-old schoolteacher, holding the reins of two massive, terrified draft horses. She didn't flinch. Micah jammed a thick cedar branch under the axle. Silas grabbed the wheel spokes. The muscles in his back strained against his canvas coat. Now, Silas roared. Abby cracked the reins. Ha! Get up, ha! She pulled left with everything she had. Her shoulders burned. The horses surged forward. Silas and Micah heaved upward. The wood groaned. The mud made a wet, sucking sound. The wheel popped out of the rut. The wagon slammed onto solid ground. Abby hauled back on the reins, settling the team. She was breathing hard. Her hands were bleeding again. Her skirt was ruined with red clay. Silas walked up to the front of the wagon. He patted the neck of the near horse. Then he looked at Abby. He didn't offer a patronizing compliment. He didn't say, good job for a woman. He just reached out, took his handkerchief from his pocket, and gently wiped a splatter of freezing mud from her cheek. Good hands, he said. It was the highest compliment a man like Silas Vance could give. Implicit, absolute, equal. They made camp that night in a shallow ravine. It offered a slight break from the wind. Micah took the first watch, disappearing up the ridge into the dark. Silas and Abby sat by the small, smokeless fire. The coffee was boiling in a tin pot. The silence between them was different now. It wasn't the silence of secrets. It was the silence of soldiers resting before a charge. Silas poured her a cup. He handed it to her. Your father, Silas said softly, watching the flames.
The judge. Would he have taken this case?
Abby held the warm tin cup in her hands. She thought about Samuel Webb, a stern man, a fair man, a man who loved the law more than he loved people. He would have, Abby said, but he wouldn't have liked it. My father believed the law was a perfect machine. You put the facts in, and justice comes out. She took a sip of the bitter coffee. But he was wrong, she said. The explicit truth of the world. The law isn't a machine. The law is just a gun. It matters who is holding it. Blackwood has been holding it in Caldwell for 5 years. Tomorrow we take it out of his hands. Silas looked at her over the fire. He saw the iron in her spine. He saw the fire in her eyes. He had spent his life surviving by keeping his head down and his fences strong. He had never met anyone who looked at the world and demanded it bend to what was right. I pity the man who tries to stand in your way, Mrs. Preston, Silas said quietly. Abby offered him a small, dangerous smile. Let's hope Josiah Blackwood feels the same way. They crested the final ridge at noon on the third day. Amarillo sprawled out before them. It wasn't a metropolis, but compared to Caldwell, it was an empire. Brick buildings, telegraph wires. The heavy, unmistakable presence of federal authority. Silas drove the wagon straight to the center of town. The federal courthouse was a 3-story brick structure. It had white columns and heavy oak doors. It looked like a fortress. Silas pulled the team to a halt. He tied the brake. He stepped down and walked around to Abby S.'s side. He offered his hand. She took it. She stepped down onto the wooden boardwalk. She was covered in trail dust. Her dress was mud-stained at the hem. Her hands were bandaged. She didn't look like a wealthy client. She looked like the frontier itself. Abby reached into the back of the wagon. She pulled out the heavy leather bag containing her father's ledgers. She gripped the handle tight. Silas stepped back. He didn't lead the way. He didn't walk in front of her. He took his position one step to her right and half a step back. The position of a second. The position of an ally. He looked at the heavy oak doors. Then he looked at Abby. "Ready?" he asked. Abby Preston squared her shoulders. She looked at the courthouse. She thought of her daughter. She thought of Arthur learning to read. She thought of the man standing beside her, who had given her a safe place to sleep when the world had turned its back on her. "I was born ready, Silas," Abby said. She walked up the steps. Silas Vance followed her in. The gavel fell. It was a heavy, wooden sound. It echoed off the high brick walls of the Amarillo Federal Courthouse. To Josiah Blackwood, it sounded like the end of the world. To Abby, it sounded like a door finally swinging open. Judge Okafor, a stern man appointed straight from Washington, didn't mince words. Blackwood's ledgers were seized. The railroad speculation ring was broken. The fraudulent debt against Silas Vance was wiped from the record, legally and permanently. Blackwood stood at the defendant's table. His silk vest looked loose. He didn't look at Silas. He didn't look at Abby. Bullies never look at the people they can no longer crush. Silas and Abby walked out of the courthouse. The winter sun was bright. The air was still cold, but it didn't feel heavy anymore. "It's done," Abby said. "It's done," Silas agreed. They didn't celebrate. They didn't cheer. They walked to the livery, hitched the team, and started the 3-day ride back to the Panhandle. The journey home was different. The desperate driving urgency was gone. They took their time. They talked, not about debts or bankers. They talked about the spring thaw. They talked about the new calf that would be dropping soon. They talked about the future. When the buckboard finally crested the last hill and the Vance Ranch came into view, Abby felt a knot in her chest untie. Arthur was sitting on the front porch. He had a shotgun resting across his knees. He had been sitting there for 6 days. When he saw the wagon, he stood up. He didn't raise his hands in victory. He just broke the shotgun barrel open, popped the shells out, and put the gun by the door. The watch was over. Sarah ran out of the house. She hit Abby S.'s legs like a cannonball. Abby dropped to her knees in the freezing dirt and buried her face in her daughter S.'s neck. Silas stepped down from the wagon. He looked at Arthur. "Any trouble?" Silas asked. "Town's been quiet as a tomb, boss," Arthur said. His deep voice rumbled with quiet satisfaction. "Word came down the telegraph wire yesterday morning about Blackwood. Folks in Caldwell are suddenly acting like they never heard a bad word about you or the missus." Silas nodded. He unhitched the team and led them to the barn. That evening, the kitchen was warm. The stove was glowing. Sarah was asleep. Micah was in the bunkhouse. Silas was out in the barn, checking the winter feed. Abby was wiping down the oak table. Arthur was sitting in his usual chair, his reading glasses perched on his nose, carefully tracing the letters in a worn copy of a farmer's almanac. Abby stopped wiping. She looked at the old man. "Thank you, Arthur," she said quietly, "for watching over her." Arthur looked up. He took off his glasses. "You don't need to thank me for protecting my own, Mrs. Preston," he said. It was an implicit statement of family. They weren't just blood. They were the people who stayed when the fire got hot. He set the almanac down. He looked toward the hallway, toward the spare room where Sarah was sleeping. "You fought a hard battle in that city," Arthur said. You used the law to beat a crooked man. That is a fine thing. You taught him that a woman isn't a piece of property to be traded. He paused. He looked back at Abby. But there's something else you need to know, Arthur said. Something about the man who took you to that city. Abby set the rag down. What about Silas? Arthur leaned forward. He rested his massive, calloused hands on the table. You remember the first night you came here? Arthur asked. You were soaked to the bone, shivering. You asked for one night of shelter, and he put you in that room down the hall. I remember, Abby said. Did you ever look at the paint on the walls in that room, ma'am? Abby frowned. It's yellow, pale yellow. Yes, ma'am, Arthur said. Now, Sliss Vance is a man who doesn't care much for color. He likes brown wood and gray steel. But his wife, Margaret, she always wanted a yellow room. They never had the money for the paint before she got sick. After she died, that room sat empty, dark, full of dust. For 7 years, he kept the door shut. Arthur pointed a thick finger at the table. A month before you walked up our road, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant hum, Silas rode into town. He bought 2 cans of pale yellow paint. He came back here. He opened that door. He scrubbed the floors until his hands bled. He painted the walls. He washed the quilts. He chopped fresh cedar for the mattress ticking. Abby stopped breathing. He didn't know you were coming, Arthur said. The explicit truth hit the air like a hammer. He didn't know your name. He didn't know a widow from Missouri was going to be standing in the mud. But he knew he couldn't live in a graveyard anymore. He prepared that room for life. He was waiting for somebody who needed it. Tears, hot and sudden, rushed into Abby's eyes. He didn't take you in out of pity, Mrs. Preston, Arthur said softly. Pity is when you throw a dog a bone. Silas Vance built a home, and then he waited for the person who belonged in it. You didn't interrupt his life. You are the life he was making room for. Abby covered her mouth with her hand. A ragged sob tore through her throat. It was the ultimate implicit revelation of Silas's character. He hadn't demanded anything from her because he had already given the gift before she even asked for it. He hadn't rescued her to make himself a hero. He had prepared a sanctuary, trusting that one day the world would send someone who needed it. The back door clicked open. Silas walked in. He hung his hat on the peg. He looked at Abby. He saw the tears shining on her face. He saw Arthur sitting quietly at the table. Silas froze. What's wrong? Did someone ride out here? Abby shook her head. She wiped her eyes. She walked across the kitchen. She didn't stop until she was standing right in front of him. She looked up at his scarred, tired, beautiful face. She didn't say a word about the yellow paint. She didn't have to. She just reached up, framed his face with her rough, blistered hands, and pulled him down. She rested her forehead against his. Silas closed his eyes. He wrapped his heavy arms around her. He pulled her against his chest. He buried his face in her hair. There were no fireworks. There was no sweeping music. There was just the steady, rhythmic sound of a man's heart beating against the chest of a woman who had finally stopped running. They stood there in the warm kitchen, rooted to the floor, safe. Spring comes to the Texas Panhandle like a sudden breath of air. One day, the earth is frozen iron. The next, the ice cracks. The mud turns soft. The prairie grass pushes up green and violent through the red dirt. It was April 1879. 6 months since Abby had walked out of Caldwell in the freezing rain. The morning air smelled of wet earth and coffee. Abby was out by the corral. She was wearing a simple cotton dress. No corsets, no heavy wool. She was brushing down the old white mare, Flower. Silas walked out of the barn. He was carrying a heavy leather halter. He stopped by the wooden fence. He leaned against the top rail, watching her. Abby felt his eyes on her. She turned. She smiled. It was an easy, unobstructed thing. "She's shedding her winter coat," Abby said, patting the horse's neck. "Spring does that," Silas. He set the halter on the fence post. He didn't look away from her. "Abby," he said. His tone was different. It wasn't the voice he used for ordering supplies. It wasn't the voice he used for breaking horses. It was low, direct. Abby put the brush down. She walked over to the fence. She stood facing him, the rough wooden rail between them. "I am a quiet man," Silas said. He looked her square in the eyes. "I will probably always be a quiet man. I don't know the poetry they write in the books you read. I work before I speak, and I have scars that ache when the weather turns cold." Abby nodded. "I know. That night in the rain," Silas continued, his voice steady. "You looked at me, you were bleeding, and you were freezing, and you asked me for exactly one night of shelter." He reached across the fence. He took her hand. His thumb traced the fading white scars across her knuckles, the scars she had earned, pulling his harvest in the freezing wind. "From the second you walked across my threshold," Silas said, speaking the explicit truth of his heart. "From the second you lit the stove and taught Arthur his letters and looked at me without flinching, I knew one night would never be enough." Abby's breath hitched in her throat. "I am not asking you to owe me anything," Silas said. "I am not asking for a debt to be paid. I am offering you the rest of my life. Not because I need a woman to keep my house, but because a house without you in it, to me, is just rotting wood. I want you to stay. I want you to be my wife." It was a pragmatic proposal, bound in iron and honesty. Abby looked at the man holding her hand. She thought of Thomas, who had demanded everything and given nothing. And then she looked at Silas, who had given her his home, his protection, and his profound respect without ever asking for a single coin in return. "I have conditions," Abby said. Her voice was thick, but a smile touched the corners of her mouth. "Name them." "When you are hurting, you tell me," Abby said. "You don't freeze me out." "Done. And Sarah has a voice in this house. Always." "She already does," Silas said simply. Abby gripped his hand tight. "Then my answer is yes, for the rest of my life. Yes." Silas didn't smile with his mouth. He smiled with his eyes. He leaned across the wooden rail and kissed her. It wasn't desperate. It was deep. It was the kiss of a man who had finally found the piece of his soul he thought he had lost forever. 6 years later, autumn 1884. The porch of the Vance Ranch had been expanded. It wrapped around the side of the house now, facing west to catch the sunset. Arthur sat in a rocking chair on the porch. He was 66 years old. His hair was completely white. He was holding a piece of paper in his hands. He was reading it out loud. "Party of the first part agrees to purchase 50 head of prime steers at the rate of $22 a head. A cattle buyer from Kansas City stood at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked impatient. He looked uncomfortable. "It's a standard contract, old man," the buyer snapped. "Just tell Vance to sign it." Arthur lowered the paper. He looked over the rim of his spectacles. "It ain't standard," Arthur said, his voice a low, threatening rumble. "Clause 4 says you deduct $3 a head for transport shrinkage. We don't pay your transport cost. You take this back, you write it clean, or you ride off our land empty-handed. The explicit power of education." The buyer turned red, snatched the paper, and walked back to his wagon to draft a new copy. Arthur went back to his rocking chair there, a quiet smile on his face. Out by the barn, Micah was packing a saddlebag. He was 28 now. He wore a canvas jacket and a silver belt buckle. A group of 3 white men on horseback waited near the gate. They were government surveyors, sent by the state of Texas. Micah walked over to them. He pulled a map from his saddlebag. It was drawn in black ink, but it had red markings all over it. Comanche markings. "We don't take the North Pass," Micah told the lead surveyor. "White man's map says it's open. The land says it floods in October. We go south, through the canyon." The white surveyor didn't argue. He nodded. "You're the scout, Micah. Lead the way." Implicit equality, earned through undeniable competence and demanded through absolute self-respect. Micah swung onto his horse and led the men out onto the plains. Inside the kitchen, the air smelled of baking apples. Sarah sat at the oak table. She was 15 years old. Her hair was tied back in a neat braid. In front of her sat 3 heavy, leather-bound ledgers. Silas walked into the kitchen. He took his hat off. He had more gray in his beard now, but his shoulders were just as broad. He walked up behind Sarah and looked over her shoulder at the columns of numbers. "How does the winter feed account look?" Silas asked. "We're ahead," Sarah said confidently, tapping her pencil on the paper. "I moved the surplus funds from the spring cattle sale to cover the new grain silos. We have a 20% buffer if the winter runs long." Silas rested his heavy hand on her shoulder. He squeezed it gently. "You have your mother's mind for numbers," Silas said proudly. "And your instinct for survival," Sarah replied, not missing a beat. The back door opened. Abby walked in. She was carrying a basket of late-season tomatoes from the garden. She set the basket on the counter. She looked at her husband and her daughter, working together at the table. She was 44 years old. She was a teacher. She was a mother. She was a wife. But above all, she was free. That night, the house settled into a deep, comfortable quiet. Sarah went to her room. Arthur was asleep in the bunkhouse. Silas and Abby sat on the porch. The kerosene lantern hung on a nail, casting a warm amber glow over the wooden floorboards. The Texas stars were burning cold and bright in the black sky. The wind whispered through the dry grass. Silas was holding Abby's hand. His thumb traced the smooth silver wedding band on her finger. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Abby leaned her head against his shoulder. She looked out at the vast, endless dark of the prairie. She thought about the woman she had been 6 years ago. A woman shivering in the mud, holding $4.37, begging the universe for a single night of safety. She closed her eyes. She listened to the steady, rhythmic breathing of the man beside her. He hadn't given her a night. He had given her a lifetime, and she had given him his soul back. The wind blew. The lantern flickered, but it held its flame. They sat together in the warm light, 2 whole people, exactly where they were always meant to be. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.
And so we leave Abigail and Silas on a porch wrapped in amber lantern light, watching the Texas stars burn cold and bright over the land they built together. Her head on his shoulder, his thumb tracing the silver ring on her finger. 2 people who arrived at each other broken and chose, deliberately, repeatedly, at great personal cost, to become whole. But let's go back to the beginning, because the beginning is everything. $4.37. That number is not just a detail. It is the entire moral architecture of this story. It tells us exactly what kind of woman Abigail Preston is before she ever opens her mouth, because she counted it. She knew the exact weight of her ruin, down to the last copper penny, and she kept walking anyway. She didn't sit down in the mud and wait for rescue. She wrapped her scarf around her daughter, not herself, and she turned west into the dark. That single quiet act, removing her own warmth and giving it to a child, contains everything this story wants to say about love. Real love is not the grand gesture. It is the scarf. It is the thing you give away when you have almost nothing left, without fanfare, without calculation, because someone you love needs it more than you do. And this story is full of those moments. The tin of calendula salve left on a counter without a word, an old white horse tied to a porch post day after day until a frightened child was ready to reach out, 8 silver dollars placed on a table, not paper script, but weight, truth, the wages of honest work. A room painted pale yellow before the person who needed it ever existed in a man's life. That yellow room. We need to stay there for a moment, because it is perhaps the most radical act of love in this entire story. Silas Vance didn't know Abby's name. He didn't know her history, her ruined boots, or her $4. He simply knew that he had spent 7 years living in a graveyard, and that it was time to make room for life. He opened a door he had kept shut. He scrubbed the floors. He painted the walls the color his wife had always wanted and never gotten to see. And then he waited, not for a specific person, but for whoever the world would send that needed a safe place to land. That is not rescue. That is something far more profound. That is a man quietly, privately, without any audience, choosing to believe that the future was worth preparing for. It is the difference between a man who wants to be seen as a hero and a man who simply does the work of being good. And the story is deeply honest about what gets in the way of that goodness. It is honest about silence as both a gift and a wound. Silas's silence on the porch was the same silence that nearly destroyed everything in the kitchen 4 days later. The same quality, that deep, stoic, interior life that made him trustworthy, also made him unreachable. And Abby, carrying the ghost of a husband who had used silence as a weapon of abandonment, could not always tell the difference. This is perhaps the story's most important and most human truth, that our past trauma is not our identity, but it is absolutely our interpreter. It is the lens through which we read every new moment. Abby heard Silas's silence through the filter of Thomas's betrayal, and she nearly let that ghost write an ending that wasn't true. It took Arthur, 60 years old, holding a piece of chalk in a hand built for iron, to say the thing she needed to hear. You are not listening to him. You are listening to the ghosts in your own head.